everyone. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's event celebrating the launch of The Freezer Door by Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore here at the Poetry Project, or as I'm thinking of it these days, the virtual church. My name is Andrea Abikaram, and I'm the Communications and Development Coordinator here at the Poetry Project. As we're all new to this, I ask that you bear with us if there's any technical difficulties, and would like to remind everyone that we are recording this event, and please feel free to keep your camera off or on as you prefer. I'll also note that to access a live transcript of tonight's event, click the live red indicator in the upper left corner of the screen, and then click View Stream, and the live transcript will open in a new browser for you to see. One of our moderators for tonight, Corey Hutchinson, is adding a PDF to the chat now that includes some more tips and directions for Zoom. If you have any trouble with Zoom during tonight's event or any Zoom questions you need help with, please feel free to chat Corey directly. Corey is now also adding a statement of our safer spaces to the chat. The Poetry Project's commitment to safer spaces does not change according to whether the space we share is physical or virtual, distal or proximal, and we extend appreciation to you for joining us in this commitment in this community. I want to thank the Poetry Project staff who are making this event possible, including Maddie D'Angelo, Corey Hutchinson, Nicole Wallace, and Laura Henriksen. I think of the event space as a decolonial pathway that points to potential for the return of stolen land to the indigenous people that the state violently stole it from in the first place. In the context of occupied Lenape-Ho-King, where I'm speaking from, I'm thinking specifically about the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. Corey is putting this map in the chat, not to endorse it as complete, but to invite you to learn continually about the land you occupy, its history, and its ties. And with this foundation of optimism of the event space as a pathway towards decolonization, I am thrilled to introduce tonight's program celebrating The Freezer Door by Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore, who will first read from the work and then be in conversation with Maggie Nelson. Following the formal conversation, we will open up the Zoom room to audience questions. As your questions come up, feel free to post them in the chat. And Corey is adding a link to purchase The Freezer Door at Greenlight Books, a local bookstore in Brooklyn now. When I think of Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore's life and work, I like to embrace the gay tendency of over-identification and think of how we have parallel trajectories in the places we have lived, from all night rolling at the water's edge of the Charles River in Boston, Massachusetts, that we see in Sketch to See, and the fraughtness of seeing the Bay Area gentrified and then gentrified again by Silicon Valley tech bros that she shows us in the end of San Francisco. Across these geographies that we share, Boston, the Bay Area, New York, I look to Mattilda's work time and time again when I need to know how the communities we have been a part of in the collective work towards abolition sustains intimacy that survives beyond the throes of the dance floor. In The Freezer Door, Sycamore takes us on a tour of cruising at Volunteer Park, memories of ACT UP meetings and marches, unreturned phone calls from friends and lovers and everyone in between, conceptual conversations between the ice cube and the ice cube tray, quiet moments between strangers she's just hooked up with, and the weighted filmy layers of witnessing and being part of the gentrification of San Francisco and Seattle. She's in search of answers to her questions about queer radical communities' imperfections and failures of accountability processes, why normcore gay culture took off so much, why smoke machines incite durational chronic pain, why she still goes to the gay bars even though they're gay and not queer, why fags don't call her back when they say they will, and why desire is not always enough. There's not always enough desire. Instead of giving us answers to these big questions, she creates a literary world to house them in a poetic space alongside the memories of cruising and conflict. This dexterously crafted space takes the form of hyper-present, ever-refining prose that drenches the reader in a loneliness that embraces the process and duration of queer loneliness in the face of our ever-rampant global capitalist world. She shows us how this global reality filters into her interactions with strangers on the streets of Seattle, or rather non-interactions. Quote from the book, "A few weeks later, some guy behind me on the street was mumbling something about where purple is a pastel, and obviously it isn't, but I knew he was talking to me, and random people in Seattle never talk to me, and it really breaks my heart. It breaks my heart on a daily basis. People say it's the Seattle freeze, like this is some kind of cute local popsicle flavor. But really, it's just the gentrified gaze, the suburban imagination in the urban environment. She shows us the possibilities of language to match the chaos of queer life as the freezer door asserts an anti-linear, anti-redemptive structure that collapses the distance between speaker and reader into shared poetic consciousness. Quote, when I say make out, I don't mean it as a euphemism for something else. I mean lips to lips until there's no space between desire and possibility. On Pub Day, The Freezer Door was glowingly reviewed in the New York Times Book Review by Krista Arnott as, quote, hungry for a new form of intimacy, and by Kristen Millars Young of the Washington Post as, quote, an aching, playful memoir of vivid desire. I can't even begin to share how thrilled I am to see this much explicit queer cruising being praised by these big liberal newspapers. Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore is the author of 3 novels and a memoir and the editor of 5 nonfiction anthologies. Her memoir, The End of San Francisco, won a Lambda Literary Award, and her anthology, Why Are Faggots So Afraid of Faggots? Flaming Challenges to Masculinity, Objectification, and the Desire to Conform, was an American Library Association Stonewall Honor book. Her most recent novel, Sketch to See, was one of NPR's best books of 2018. Sycamore lives in Seattle. She will read first, followed by her in conversation with Maggie. Maggie Nelson is the author of 9 books of poetry and prose, including the National Book Critics Circle Award winner, The Argonauts, The Art of Cruelty, A Reckoning, Bluets, The Red Parts, and Jane, a Murder. She has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Nonfiction, an NEA Fellowship in Poetry, an Innovative Literature Fellowship from Creative Capital, and an Arts Writers Fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation. In 2016, she was awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. She lives in Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore to the virtual stage.
Thank you for that incredible introduction, Andrea. That was a whole essay right there. And I so appreciate your deep reading of this book and all of my work. That type of introduction only happens at the Poetry Project. So thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm so honored to be in conversation with Maggie Nelson. And I'm so delighted to see people here from all over the place. Join me in my living room. So usually at a reading, I always tell people, you know, if I was in a bookstore or community space, I would say, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves. You know, if you need to jump up and down, if you need to stretch, if you need to go to the bathroom, if you need to laugh, cry, you know, buy 12 books, call your friends, whatever you need to do it, right? So we all know that already because we're in our own homes tonight. So what I hope is that we can take the comfort of being in our own spaces and the possibility of being here together in this room and feel that communal possibility. So I'm going to take one sip of water and then I'm going to read and then I'll be in conversation. And feel free to, light up the chat. I love all of this and I'll be reading it afterwards too. I'll be savoring it. So thank you. I have to remember, I don't have to look at myself while I'm drinking water. Okay, so I'm going to read from like a little before or half the way through the book. There's a tree I love on the way to Volunteer Park. White flowers, except in one tiny part by the trunk where purple flowers grow. Every year this happens, or twice a year, because in Seattle, everything blooms twice. And I wish this wasn't just literal. I'm in the park. If I listen carefully enough, maybe the sound of the chirping birds will drown out the leaf blowers. I wake up with a phrase in my head about trying to get my body back from my father. Except, I don't know if I've ever had it. Not in all the ways I need. I wake up with a phrase that became a whole paragraph, but what was it? There was confidence there too, confidence that I would succeed. But then I'm outside and already I'm too exhausted to reach down to pick up a good luck penny. What if I can't get back up off the ground? I turn the radio on, and some soldier or former soldier is talking about watching pieces of his friend's skull blown off his head. I think there are limits to this kind of mourning. Then there's a thunderstorm. No, it's just the trucks hauling away the debris from the two beautiful houses they tore down yesterday, making way for a new building to house people who could have been housed better and more cheaply in the old buildings. Sometimes we wait so long that we're no longer waiting, and sometimes we wait so long that we're dead. Once, I treated myself for parasites the way the doctors recommended. I treated myself and I never recovered from the treatment. Everyone says they want to catch up. I mean, when they actually call me back. But I want relationships where we don't have to catch up. Sometimes I feel like an entire culture has misplaced something. And it's everything. Suddenly, I'm remembering a public conversation between two great straight white male writers. We've all made the mistake of going to this event at least once, right? After great straight white male writer one reads, it's time for the Q&A. This is where we're supposed to find profound insight. The questions are always the same, so the answers can shine all the more brilliantly. Great straight white male writer 2 says to great straight white male writer 1, who is your ideal audience? And great straight white male writer 1 says, everyone in my ideal audience is dead. It's hard to imagine anything more damaging to literature than questions about audience. Then again, it's hard to imagine anything more damaging to literature than literature. When people look at me with a mixture of horror and surprise, I think about the way the city of today is just a place for the gawkers to pretend they have a cosmopolitan outlook. Maybe it's a fashion thing, but it's also trauma. Can we ever separate fashion from trauma? I thought I was going to walk around the cemetery, but instead I walk around the wall around the cemetery. So often, there's more protection for the dead than for the living. It's obvious that a gated community is a graveyard. A graveyard has gates to protect the dead from living. I'm worried that's what the city is becoming. Suburban suspicion repackaged as imagination. Consumption rebranded as creativity. Every new building looks like an office park. And we all know an office park is another kind of graveyard, walling off dreams in search of profit. A graveyard can be a beautiful place to imagine the dead and our lives that remain, to study the stones and names and look at the way the tree pushes those graves to the side. Another kind of history. A graveyard can be a respite from the living, even just to watch trees against sky, those clouds growing bolder. But we cannot live in a graveyard. The dream of the city is that you will find everything and everyone you never imagined. Does this possibility even exist anymore? I wonder what it feels like to be famous, says the ice cube. It means you never have any privacy, says the ice cube tray. I don't really understand privacy, says the ice cube. I'm not sure how to respond to that, says the ice cube tray. I just wish there was a solution to beauty, says the ice cube. Do you mean a solution for beauty? Asked the ice cube tray. I wish there weren't so many jokes about slipping, says the ice cube. Maybe a banana peel, I guess that one's okay, but when someone says you're on thin ice, it makes me feel like I'm never going to amount to anything. I feel like we've been through this one before, says the ice cube tray. That's easy for you to say, says the ice cube. I'm just not offended as easily as you are, says the ice cube tray. I'm not offended, says the ice cube. It's just that the whole world is telling me to click my heels together or snap my fingers or order something new from the menu or pick up the remote control or call room service or hide out in a fallout shelter or go on vacation or swallow a bunch of pills or go shopping for another pair of shoes or find a psychic healer or drown in my own sorrows. They might as well just cut the power cord. Have you been crying? Asked the ice cube tray. Something feels less solid. It was just my insomnia, says the ice cube. I'm sorry if I woke you. You didn't wake me, says the ice cube tray. I don't sleep as much as you think I do. I was just dozing off. What's the difference between sleeping and dozing off? Asked the ice cube. Now that's better, says the ice cube tray. You sound like you're again. I worry about you sometimes, says the ice cube tray. I worry about you too, says the ice cube. Well, I guess as long as we're on the same page about this, says the ice cube tray, there's nothing wrong with a little worry. But what about a lot of worry? Sometimes I worry a lot, says the ice cube. I know you do, says the ice cube tray. I don't understand elections, says the ice cube. Who wins and who loses? It doesn't seem to make a difference. I'm with you on that one, says the ice cube tray. But what about the Supreme Court? What about the Supreme Court, says the ice cube. Those justices stay with us for a while, says the ice cube tray. Citizens United? I know we both agree about that one. It just seems like no matter who's in power, there's always too much power, says the ice cube. Oh, so now you're a poet, says the ice cube tray. I'm bored, says the ice cube. Is there anything good on TV? You know the answer to that question, says the ice cube tray. Remember that art show we saw once, says the ice cube. Which one? Says the ice cube tray. It was about graffiti, says the ice cube. Oh yeah, says the ice cube tray. I remember that one. Banksy. Basquiat, says the ice cube. Shepard Fairey, says the ice cube tray. Keith Haring, says the ice cube. Before he became famous. Like when the people are partying with the pyramids and fighting off spaceships and flailing in the streets and dancing on TV, and the TV becomes the baby's head, which is a baby on TV, but the baby's still crawling through the end of the world. So maybe we can find each other. It's a little too obvious for me, says the ice cube tray. I like some of the lesser known artists. Like who? Says the ice cube. I can't remember their names, says the ice cube tray. What about the one that tags "kiss me" on the inside of the freezer, says the ice cube. Now you're talking, says the ice cube tray. I like political graffiti too, says the ice cube. No more prisons. That's just not practical, says the ice cube tray. Everything doesn't have to be practical, says the ice cube. Thank you.
We're going to ask everyone to unmute so you can clap and scream for Mattilda. Kindly ask that you all mute yourselves. And there will be an opportunity to clap and scream and cheer again later. Thank you so much, Mattilda. I I finished reading The Freezer Door last night, and it's just such a thrill to get to hear you read from it. And now I'm going to ask Maggie Nelson to unmute, and the two of you can take it away.
Oh, great. There I am, unmuted. Okay. Hi, everybody. Hi, Mattilda. How are you?
Hi, Maggie. I'm doing
Hi,
great. Thanks so much for
Um,
being here.
I wasn't allowed to unmute while everybody else got to, maybe because I was here, so now I get to go woo because I was trying to do it and it was like not happening. And I'm writing, I wrote I can't in the chat somehow. I'm so happy to be here. I see people I know and don't know, as I'm sure you do too, and all these participants. All this time is so crazy and lonely, and it's just like, it's hi Lawler, what's up? It's like, it's totally it's just, I don't know, it's like I actually have adrenaline, which is a feeling I don't have anymore, like in seeing all of you. And I can't, say enough good things about Mattilda's book, and I'm sure that some of you have read it already, but if you haven't, you need to buy it tonight. And it was definitely one of the, if not the best books I've read all year. And we started talking about doing this event, I think at like the beginning of COVID, right? Like,
Yeah, like I think right before. Yeah.
yeah, I think right before. And it was kind of like, yeah, let's do that at the project, unless I don't know what. So it's really also great to be here because it feels like, I don't know, it feels like the end chapter of something that started a long time ago. And I didn't know it would be like this, but this is how it is, and it's great. So thank you for asking me to do this. And I'm going to ask Mattilda a bunch of questions that she will hopefully answer, and then we will turn it over to you guys. You can throw stuff into the chat now. But I just might, I'll just have to kind of scroll up and down and find it later. But so I don't know, I have like this one burning question I've had ever since I read The Freezer Door that I just wanted to ask, because I think I love the book so much because I was just totally, and hearing you read it underscored this all the more, but I was so taken with its style, and I felt like, and the utter surprise of, the happy surprise of every line. And I just felt like it was one of those books that I got in the mail, and every sentence I read, I just thought, is it going to fall off the tightrope this sentence or this sentence? And it just streaked through the sky on the tight wire the whole time. But this composition strategy that it has, which I wouldn't really call non sequitur, but it definitely is like this layering of these of quasi non sequitur thoughts, but that obviously make a form of sense. But I just wondered if you could, well, I'll just read one example that I had in mind, where it says, the problem with true confessions is there aren't any, but it's amazing how many ugly 1916s buildings have beautiful wood floors. But it's like that kind of sentence. And I'm just dying to know how you went about writing these sentences or juxtaposing them, and what the strategy was in your composition.
Yeah, thank you. That's an amazing question. So basically when I started, and this is true whenever I start a new book, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just start writing. And so, and then as I'm writing, I'll sort of become interested in certain things, but I don't take into consideration what it is as a whole at all. I basically just throw everything into one document, and it, without thinking about it. And of course, as I'm writing, I start becoming interested in particular themes, particular experiences that sort of start to develop some kind of structure, but I pay no attention to it as a whole. So I wrote for a couple years before I looked at it as a document. And I waited until I felt, like, actually one thing that stimulated was I was invited to read at this reading series, the Furnace reading series in Seattle. And the theme for that year was writing about Seattle. And I was like, oh no, well, all my writing about Seattle is in this document. So I have to look at it and pull something from it. And that was what became the beginning of the book. I knew what the strongest part of it was. I was like, this is really polished. Let me pull from that. But the ice cube tray, which is also at the beginning of the book, that wasn't even in there. That was like a different part of this random document. And it was like, each one was in a different, they were not together at all. That was just sort of something that was like rolling through. I was just playing with it. And it actually started like, I like Twitter as like experimenting with text out of context. And so that just started as this series you know, random thoughts about ice cube tray. But I pulled those things together, and for that reading series, then I was like, okay, I think I have a beginning. But I still was like, I don't know what the hell this is. It's not ready for me to look at it as a whole yet. So then I wrote for maybe another year. And interestingly, this is random actually. There was a different reading series I was invited to participate in, and that one had a prompt. And the prompt was animals. And I was like, animals? That was the Hugo House literary series. I was like, I don't have anything to say about animals. But of course, prompts are great because you can just say whatever the hell you want to say. And so I wrote this whole thing that ends up, I think the ending of it is, I can't remember exactly, but basically at that part, that part and that sort of circle, I remember I did write kind of like an outline for that. It wasn't really an outline. No, it was like every thought that I could possibly think of on like this page. And then I like drew lines like to these different things. And then I was like, oh, okay. So I made that piece. And then when I read that piece, I thought, oh, well, this maybe is like kind of the ending of the book. It's not actually in the ending of this book, but in that moment, I thought, okay, I think I have an arc. And I think the beginning of it, that beginning I chose is the moment of realizing that it's that moment of like exploration of desire and impossibility, or realizing that I don't have like in queer worlds, I don't have an embodied self, and realizing, oh, maybe I have to go into these worlds that I already know are corrupt in order to find what is it. And so it's that exploration, like towards embodiment, towards sweetness, towards
Towards what?
I guess, yeah, like
towards embodiment.
Oh, say that again.
Oh, you just said towards
sweetness.
embodiment. Sweetness. Okay.
Yeah. But I think especially embodiment actually, because so embodiment, of course, can be like a really pleasurable experience. You know, it can be sensual or sexual, or it can be like walking outside and feeling alive with the wind on your face. But it can also be loss and longing, desperation, devastation, and the shutting down. And so that's kind of, I guess, in a way, I structured the book toward feeling, whatever the feeling would be. And I guess in that process, I don't know if I was aware of this as I did it, but I wanted the text, because I'm circling around this whole thing about, so like the first line of the book is, one problem with gentrification is that it always gets worse, right? And so I don't know if I knew why I had that line when I started it, but the reason, you know, now I know, is because the landscape in which the book takes place is gentrification. Mm-hmm. So desire and embodiment and all take place within that, right? And so does everything else. So does like a tree, or so does, you know, looking at the sky, or so does a phone conversation with someone. But also there's that elliptical structure where I'm circling around, trying to find something, which is this kind of like connection, embodiment, those moments that might change you. And I also want the language to do that. So the sentences themselves are also sort of circling around themselves. You know, one idea might reverse itself, and then it might reverse itself again. And the goal is to find, you know, maybe it's to find like, I don't know if it's as much truth as it is about like that embodied sense, you know? And so sometimes things that seem contradictory, like actually take place in the same realm, in my mind, at least. And so I guess for me, like I should say, when I finally took a look at the whole thing, I still don't believe this because I looked at the document just recently, but I had 1,000 pages of something.
No way.
And yeah. So a lot of what you're asking about is really the editing process. So I'm like super neurotic about editing. Like I probably had about 15 drafts. And the book now, for those who haven't seen it, it's very compact. It's like 200 and something pages, but there are pages that are just like one sentence, you know, or one paragraph. And so for me, like the text breaks when the feeling can no longer hold, right? And so I guess it's that quest toward feeling, and also the way in which the overwhelm of not being able to exist, basically, also breaks the text, you know? And so I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's like a little bit about the process.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And I think that what you're describing, I don't know, it's very brilliant the way that you're putting it about, as someone just said in the chat, when the text breaks, when the feeling can no longer hold, because that's exactly how it feels. Like it's not just, you know, surrealist surprise about like this something, you know, surprising comes after this. It is like an emotional arc of like you crest into something, or a difficult thought, or some kind of moment, or even just a provocation or proposition that like doesn't hold, and then it just keeps tumbling. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about embodiment and kind of and belonging. And you have this quote. I feel like I have all these things printed out, and like people who are mentioned in your book and in my questions are probably like here somewhere. So it's very strange. But so you have this part where you say, Sarah Schulman describes going to the LGBT Center in New York for a community meeting and thinking, these are my people, which is something I've literally never thought in my life. And it was really interesting, like your whole book, as you just said, about finding these moments of being unable to be, or being unable to be as an embodied being. Like it was so interesting because we don't know each other. I only know your work, but I think I had this feeling before reading this book. I thought it was kind of like, oh, like all the cool kids belong, and like I'm the one who feels not belonging or something. And it was just so fascinating to me, where I was like, what, like, you know, Mattilda's not feeling at home in these queer scenes. Like it was so, I don't know, it was like a revelation of what we already all of us know, which is that nobody is at home. I mean, maybe Sarah Schulman is at the LGBT Center in this particular year, but this feeling of like, you know, that even if you feel like you've found your people, that feeling flickers and it falls apart, and we don't know what that means. And the way that you throw all of that through the lens of like feminist and queerness. And I just want to throw out one more quote, and then you can hear what you have to say. But you say, without feminism, there would be no queer. But without queer, there would be no feminism, at least not for queers like me. And yet, why do I now feel disembodied in oppositional queer spaces? It's something about the bodies that aren't welcome, including mine. Loyalty to a scene masquerading as critical engagement. Somehow this never fails to demoralize me. The hierarchies are different, yes, but they're still hierarchies. I just have to read one more because it's so great. You say, I worry that queer spaces have become places where the illusion of critical thinking hides the policing of thought. I don't want any team to win. I want to end winning. I guess, you know, even though the book is kind of about this, I wondered if you might say more, because in some ways it felt tantalizingly like opaque to me about what about the body not belonging has to do with feminism and queerness as like political ideologies or something, if that makes any sense. Like,
yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, tell me at the end if I've actually gone there.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I love everything you're quoting, and I love your engagement in this. I feel like in a similar way to the text is created, you know. And so I think for me, I guess one way I would look at it is, as queers, you know, we often say that desire is what got us here, right? And desire is what opened up, you know, as kids, we didn't necessarily, we're not able to actualize ourselves. But once we were able to connect to that desire, that's where queerness came in. And I guess what I'm exploring in the book is that feeling of being in queer spaces where desire is actually not possible to be actualized. And where we have these radical visions of community building and of accountability and mutuality, negotiation, transformation, fluidity, openness, but where those, even in those worlds, you know, with those values, there are still sometimes hierarchies that are just as vicious. You know, they might be reversed, or they might be turned around, but they still play out in terms of who is allowed inside and who's outside, right? And a lot of that is actually based on desire. So the most obvious example would be like, you know, not in necessarily queer worlds, but in like, let's say gay male culture, right? Where everyone knows about, you know, gay bars, right? Where the only thing that matters is is what can pass into the realm of like unquestioning masculinity and like stereotypical desirability, right? Everything else is garbage, you know? And so racism, misogyny, classism, you know, self-hatred, body fascism, those are just central to those spaces, right? And, but I think in queer worlds that are in many ways built as alternatives to that hypocrisy of those gay male worlds, they still in many ways are based on who is desired and who isn't, right? And so, and I think, you know, again, so the most obvious example in queer world, well, actually, I guess there in queer worlds now, and by queer, I mean, of course, oppositional, non-normative, against both straight and gay normalcy, dedicated to, you know, flamboyance and transformation and gender, sexual, social, and political self-determination for everyone. But in so many of those worlds, they still have, you know, these hierarchies, and some of them are actually similar. So let's say, I would say, you know, when I first started going into queer worlds, it was when I was like 19 and I moved to San Francisco in 1992. And, you know, I was searching for like radical outsider weirdos, freaks, anarchists, activists, dreamers, dropouts, you know, whores, sluts, vegans, you know, and in those worlds, so there was this possibility of self-creation, of course, but also those worlds in the early 90s were also incredibly binary, right? It was like fags and dykes, and it was still what was called maybe third wave feminism was really second wave feminism for a new generation. It was still about like men are rapists and, you know, like it's had a similar analysis, right? There was no, like the trans moment had not yet happened. And also queer worlds were always, you know, a majority, vast majority, like 70, 80, 90% women or female socialized people. And so when I first started going to those worlds, I knew that I had to prove myself in order to be there, right? And I also knew that this is where I was gonna find everything. I mean, women were always my friends. You know, dykes were all central to my, you know, politics and self-actualization. And so to prove I had to prove that I wasn't the enemy, right? And that was based on like what my body looked like to people in those spaces, which of course is very similar to like, you know, second wave feminism, you know, and, but I think now we're in a different time, right? There's no avowedly queer space that would say, we only want certain bodies here. Like that would just be the most retrograde thing on earth. You know, there's been like a long conversation about, you know, trans women being included in queer spaces. So even if they're not there, which they often are not and are still excluded, no one would ever say like, oh my God, keep them out. You know, no one would say we only want these bodies. They would say we want self-actualization. And they are amazing spaces for self-actualization, but it's whose bodies are allowed, you know, is still, I would say not that different from queer spaces. Certainly when I came of age, you know, I guess almost 30 years, oh my God, ago. But I don't know if it's even that different than, you know, the 70s that everyone looks back on as, you know, the horror of, you know, like trans exclusionary radical feminism, right? And so I guess my question that I'm asking in the book in a way is in all of these spaces. So in queer spaces, in gay spaces, in dominant straight culture, like whose bodies are allowed in and whose are not. And I think there are always reasons for people to be excluded. And I don't believe, you know, I'm not like one of these people who's like, let's bring all the Trump supporters into our queer spaces and then they'll change or something, you know, or let's bring all the Biden supporters into our queer spaces and then they'll change, because there's probably not that much hope for either of them, right? But that's a tangent. but no, I guess what I'm saying is it's not a vision of, the vision is about gender or self-determination for everyone, right? And so I guess the question I have about queer spaces in particular is when I go into queer spaces now in Seattle, like if people don't know who I am, like, oh, that's Mattilda Bernstein Sycamore or something, I know I'm not welcome within minutes for most of them, you know, and it's because of a body that I exist in. And the look is kind of like, who's that faggot? And why is that faggot here? And like, and it's not the welcoming, you know, when I would see, but who's that faggot? Bring her on, you know, it's like, stop, you know? And it's like, it's not about curiosity. It's not about openness. And I feel like if I, who have existed in these spaces for decades, and I've been formed by them and have helped to form them, if I don't feel welcome, like not me, like, you know, this like status object, you know, or even me, someone who people respect and admire, but me, just a random person walking in the door, you know. And I feel like if I'm not welcome, then most people are not, you know. And because I know I can talk the talk, right? Clearly, you know, and so I guess that's the question I want to ask. Yeah, and I feel like, so and on the other side, to go back to the beginning of what I said, is that question about desire. If desire is what brought us into this queerness, if it brings us into these walls, then maybe desire is not the gateway. I don't have the answer, but that's sort of the question, I guess.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you were talking about, you know, embodiment and then differentiating in some way from desire, because I think, you know, for those of you who haven't read The Freezer Door, like something that's so beautiful, and I mean, I love sex writing. It's like just a fetish of mine. Like, I love great sex writing, which is exactly what Mattilda is writing a lot in this book. And I think what's so interesting though is that, you know, the spaces that are most evocatively and like sensually and like hotly conjured are, you know, like, you know, the narrator's face pressed into like a rhododendron, you know, in the park, and like, you know, all the kind of the dirt and foliage and scenes of the park, you know, and other places in public, and, you know, the elaborate, awesome contraption to like carry condoms like around your waist, like all that writing. And I think, you know, what's so interesting, and there is a part, I don't have it, I didn't print it out, but where there's some part where you say like I'm free, finally free, or something, describing that moment. And just what you were just saying when you were talking about if these other queer spaces that we've made, that maybe it sounds like you're describing, have more to do with maybe like embodiment than desire in some way. It seems like part of this book is reminding yourself or the reader or whomever that, you know, that a lot of desire is wild and taking place in other places that are not, that's not always within the strictures or the kind of, even in queer circles, the kind of norms of ethical sex, which can be a form of policing, you know, what, I mean, anytime you decide what's ethical sex, you've decided what is unethical and what goes outside of it. And that's a very big policing move. I'm not just saying that there should be no ethics, it's just to say that it creates a system that then, you know, it behooves us not to become blind to. I don't know if you want to say anything. I don't know whether there's a question there, but just about these other spaces and about writing about desire. And yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, desire is, yeah, I feel like a queer way of thinking about desire is that desire exists in every experience, ideally, right? And so for me, and I think for me, even like to talk specifically about sexual desire, like sex, like to me, sex in private has never been what sex is for me. And it also isn't what queerness is for me. You know, being queer means being in public space. Living in a city means living in public space, or existing in public space, I should say. And so the possibility of desire for me is when it is something that's surprising, and it is comes about in an unexpected way, and whether that way or unexpected or unsanctioned. And I think the openness to that is kind of what I'm like, I guess I say in the book, I want to feel like all the time, like the moment before I'm about to make out. So it's that moment when you know something's going to happen and your whole body is alive. And I guess that's what I'm sort of searching for in the book, in my life as well, and coming up against the sort of wall of the tyranny of the suburban imagination over urban life, where instead of people walking around looking for possibility, they have that white picket fence in their eyes, and they're like, oh my God, unplanned, whoa, or like that person is leaning against a tree. This happens to me all the time. Like I lean against trees, to even out my body, to like experience the world. It seems like a very benign experience, but you wouldn't think so based on like what people, I'm like leaning against a hedge. I'm like, why is this hedge here if not for me to lean on it? But people instead, that seems like, oh, maybe you think that's a little weird, and you'd be like, okay, hi, right? But no, people are like crossing the street, or they're like, like looking over like that, or, and it's, so I feel like, and those are those walls, and they're so artificial. And it's like, so I guess for me, desire is also that, right? It's that desire of like leaning against, of being open to the experience of whatever's happening in the world. And also it's how I stay alive. If I was just walking along, like not looking at anyone, like my eyes, blah, blah, like that's just gonna make my body hurt more. It's gonna make like my feeling of disconnection magnified. And I think also, I guess, to take one, like a formative moment for me, again, when I, that same time in the early 90s, when I first read David Monroevich, and I felt many things, but one of them was the way he describes desire as desire is three-dimensional. It's all, or maybe it's seven-dimensional. It's like in your skin, it's like in your eyes, it's in the taste buds. And the point is to actualize that, right? Like before that, I had sort of thought, because I came of age in like public, or before I was even out, like I was having sex in, public bathrooms when I was like 14, 15, 16, 17. And I was like, but I was coming into queerness, like queerness was not really like these same queer worlds I'm talking about weren't necessarily open to that experience. I was like, oh, I have to get rid of that. I still was like ashamed. But David Monroevich, or that writing in particular, like, I was like, oh, actually, this is part of what it means to be queer. I was not liberated when I was 14, 15, 16, in those spaces. No one was allowing me that space, but I can be now, And so I guess, yeah, it's like desire as an open door into experience. And I guess that's sort of what I'm after.
All right, I'm gonna ask one more questions and give you guys a chance to put things in the chat if you want to now. But when Mattilda and I were talking about doing this event and we were writing and we were realizing, and I kind of sensed this, I think maybe I even knew it before, but certainly in reading this book, that we're both born, if you don't mind my outing you and your age, we were both born in 1973, and a lot of, as you were talking, and David Monroevich is obviously in this book. I'll never forget like the day when I was, I don't know, 18, 19, and picked up Close to the Knives, and, like my head cracked open and like a whole new life started for me. And, we were like the same age during that time, and the same age through AIDS, and the same age, I'm sure different experiences, but I just, I thought one thing that was really fascinating about this book, particularly about David Monroevich, but also about Patti Smith and other things, was also the way though that you were like not afraid to like, kick the idols in the teeth a little bit, like in a really happy, good-natured way, but talking about, not even kicking them in the teeth, but just like talking about the 1998 Monroevich show, which I also saw and had the same reaction that you did to that show, and just kind of felt befuddled at, I guess he'd only been dead for a few years, but it was already very clear that the swiftness of, and the kind of, appallingness of the feeling of something suddenly being swept into the white walls. And even though you wanted it to be taken that seriously, and then as you say, you say his rage was a commodity that the art world consumed. And you ask, had he lived, would he have unlearned this? And then, Patti Smith is a different story, but you're just kind of taking just kids on like a rough ride. But I thought, I was just wondering, this is kind of a silly last question, because it's just generational and kind of, off the beaten path as a question. But I just wondered, like, do you have like anxiety about any of that, like writing about those figures, or does it just feel like an act of necessity, or just, I don't know, I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, when I realized we were both 25, Just kidding. No, I loved that amazing coincidence. It's so interesting. Like, I think to be in conversation with someone who is more or less an exact contemporary is like, wow, because, you know, I think it's queer worlds in particular, right? Like 5 years could be a whole generation, but like 10 or 15 or 20 years, you know, is like, and obviously we have commonalities across all of those lines, but that experience, and you also having that experience that we haven't talked about before of reading David Monroevich at the same time. And that question about, well, it's interesting. I feel like, so David, I'll address those two in particular, because they do come up in the book, you know, a fair amount. So David Monroevich, for me, yeah, when I first discovered him, it was like that feeling that I was in ACT UP, you know, and I had the sense, you know, coming of age in San Francisco, where it felt like everyone was dying, you know, of AIDS, of drug addiction, of suicide. And reading that the first time, what I most connected to was the rage. I was like, oh my God, this is my rage. Yeah. And I had never, I would say never experienced that in any, like, in any form had I seen it, other than people I knew, you know. And then later, or around the same time, it was that desire, desire and writing. But I would say he was, I don't know that I've ever really believed in icons, you know, or idols in my own life, but he was the closest thing for sure. But of course, but as I learned more and more about him, and as I continue to learn more and more about him, I'm pretty sure that because at that time, I learned about him in an obituary, right? So he was one of these, you know, gay men a generation older than me that was dying. And that was like how I learned about a lot of my heroes. They were either dead or they were dying. Like, it was like, go to a Derek Jarman movie. Oh, the next one, and then he's dead, you know, or like, you know, it was a lot of people. It was like David Feinberg, or like, you know, I would say a majority in some ways of the writers and artists and authors who I learned about, who were most inspiring to me, were either had just died or were about to die. And so I really felt that loss. And I was like, oh my God, what would it have been like to have known him? And I feel like knowing more and more about him, I mean, you know, like, I now am pretty sure that if I had known him, we would not have been friends. It doesn't mean I wouldn't have appreciated his work or his presence in the world, but I think especially that masculinity, he had an attachment to the exact kind of masculinity that is, you know, like, in many ways the enemy of everything that I believe in. And he also believed in flamboyance and queeniness and, you know, all of these things. But like the quote that you mentioned, you know, that some of the things he's famous for, of like, you know, like going to the art gallery and destroying it, you know, like that, you know, that thing that like generations of male artists, you know, have been like, I'm an outsider, you know, like, you're showing my work, but I hate you, you know, like that. And that's the question that you are asking, is, would he have unlearned that? And I hope so, you know, but of course there's no way to know because he's dead, you know, and he died because of structural violence, you know. And so I guess for me, I want to write into vulnerability. And so to me, it is more vulnerable to talk about the person who maybe I respect his work more than anyone, but also see him in all those complications, right? And the Patti Smith is an interesting one in a different way. So I would say, oh, and also, no, in the commodification. So I love that, what you said about going to the New Museum show, which was the first retrospective, or an earlier retrospective, I should say, not the first necessarily, but maybe the first official, not even that, because there was, but the first one after he was dead, I guess. Right. And I was like so excited because I was living in New York at that time. I was like, oh my God, I have like photocopies of the burning a house on my walls. I have like, you know, the male figures embracing. I have all of this on my wall, but I've never seen like the real art, you know? And I was like, I got into that space and I felt, at first, like, so thrilled, you know, and in awe. But really quickly, I felt like all I could feel was that he was dead, you know, and that his art in that context was also dead, you know, and because all art in that context, for the most part, is dead. Some art can survive it, I think, but I don't think that art did, at least in my experience of it. And, but also, of course, learning more, I mean, his art was, even while he was alive, was not at that level consumed, but it was a commoditized, you know, it was a commodity, you know, and he knew that, you know, and so, and he was participating in that even while being outside of it and pushed out at the same time. And so Patti Smith is a different direction. So I'm talking specifically about Just Kids. And I would say that Just Kids, like if I had to name like a cultural artifact that I would say it's the most damaging work that has come out in the last 10 or 20 years in terms of like destroying the urban imagination. And it's because she creates this mythology, right? This mythology where she just moves to New York. You know, it's the 70s in New York, and Patti Smith is on the street. She's just hanging out and like, oh my God, I just met this cool guy. You know, it's so great. And like, yeah, we're just hanging out. And then, you know, and then my friends are like, Patti, why are you hanging out with Sam Shepard? You know, and I'm like, that's not Sam Shepard. That's just like Slim, you know, whatever name. We stole steak together. He cooked it for me. You know, man, it's like, they're like, no, Patti, that's Sam Shepard. And I'm like, oh my God, Sam Shepard. And so that's her whole story. It's like, I just got famous by total coincidence, right? Now, someone can gain a little bit of fame by coincidence, but the level of fame that Patti Smith is at, which is permanent stardom, never will be removed, you get by climbing over, you know, layer after layer after layer, right? So she refuses to reveal any of that. It's never there. And so that violence, I feel like for me, oh, and the number of people, like the number of people I meet who like I did the first time I meet them and I'm like, oh, I'm a writer. And they're like, oh, I read a book. Patti Smith's Just Kids. It was like the best thing I ever read. And I'm like, oh no. The number of times that's happened, I mean, more than anything, right? Like there's nothing that comes close. And so for me with Patti Smith, like, and like it's always like it's like just everywhere, right? It's like it just keeps coming in these random ways, and so I had to like include that in the book because it's and it's that nostalgic vision, right? The idea that there was this golden age when everyone just, you know, was so creative, you know, we all just like hung out in the Chelsea Hotel and oh my God, Janis Joplin's here. Janis, can you play me a little bit? Dun, 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 Janis, you know, and people like Patti, you know, and I guess simultaneously I will say, I mean, I could go on Just Kids forever, but you know, of course, Just Kids is about her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe. And before that, I'm not like you know, I think Patti Smith has some good songs, you know, I'm not going to deny that, you know, but like, I was not a Patti Smith like super fan or anything, or so I knew nothing about her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe. That's why I read the book, because I was like, oh, that's really fascinating. And so Patti Smith is very honest about Robert Mapplethorpe, you know, his climb to fame, right? Because you can't hide it, because everyone knows about that, right? But like, well, you could hide it. I'm sure there'll be a biographer that will hide it. But so she talks about his ruthlessness and his like anything he can do to become famous, right? But it's like as a way to like naturalize her talent, because she never did any of that. She was just hanging out with Robert Mapplethorpe. Robert, why are you fucking over those people again to get me that show? I mean, not to get you that show. You know, and so it's like that. Yeah, I feel like that kind of violence, like I feel like what stars can do for us is to expose the mechanism. And Patti Smith, you know, as a star, you know, has, you know, great politics in comparison to most, you know, she's always anti-war. She, you know, will challenge certain hierarchies. But when they serve her, you know, she's more than happy to like sing Christmas songs for the Pope, you know? And so like, to me, like, I'm not looking for purity, but I want people to expose the mechanism. She's, you know, oh my God, I'm sure someone could tell us the whole story about the Chelsea Hotel and her like role in like gentrifying and, you know, evicting, you know, the people who are living there, et cetera, you know, to help the developers. I'm sure someone here knows that story better than I do, but that story's not in the book. But yeah, so it's basically like, for me, I want to expose the mechanism. And in the book, I'm exposing my own mechanism like all the time, like all the places that like I guess I'm writing toward vulnerability, and part of writing toward vulnerability is writing about everything that I'm afraid to say, right? Like whatever I feel like I might die if I say it, is what I need to say so I don't die, you know? And so, you know, I haven't reached that level of Patti Smith yet, but I hope that, you know, I will continue, and the artists that I respect and the work that I respect is the work that is always engaged in its own process and in undoing its process at the same time and exposing its process. So yeah, there's my rambling answer.
Yeah, no, it's great. And obviously, as you can tell, you've lit up the chat box. Everyone's so here for it. But one question from Griff, who says also that Griff can tell you the story about what you're asking about, but maybe for a different time. You guys can take that up in chat. But kind of segues into what you were talking about trying to figure out what you feel most vulnerable about and writing to that place. Asks what was the personally scariest thing to write in the book? What frightens you most to write about? Always a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would say if there are a few things, but well, it's interesting because sometimes it's hard to look back on it because the writing of it is so successful in undoing that fear. Because sometimes I can say things in writing that I wouldn't even tell people. And then of course they're out in the world. And so I can be more vulnerable sometimes in writing than I can with friends. I would say one thing was this experience I had in the park, you know, like cruising, where, you know, which was basically being raped, you know, but I'm, you know, unable to sort of, but like it was a non-consensual experience with someone who then later like found me randomly, I don't know, on the street and kind of, you know, like, it's not, I don't have so much about it in the book, but well, okay, no, I guess what I would say is, yeah, that experience one, the experience of like, oh, what's happening? And I guess also I feel like in public sexual spaces, there isn't really, unfortunately, negotiation is very rare. You know, consent doesn't exist in the way that we want it to in queer spaces. And so you take what you can get. This is how most people see it. And this was that moment where I'm like, someone is just taking what he could get, and that's me, that's my body. And I didn't want to see it I still don't want to see it as like a large, horrible experience, but I wanted to talk about it. And so I think moments like that. I think also talking about privilege and vulnerability at the same time. I think I always want to do both of those. And so but that also scares me. And I think, go ahead.
I was just wondering if you were mentioning kind of like the discourse running throughout the freezer door about like moving towards buying a house and like looking at houses and stuff like that. It just seemed like very interesting to me running through the book, but maybe that's not what you were getting at.
No, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that is part of it. Absolutely. Yeah, I guess what I say in the book is the feeling of wondering if you could buy a place in a city that you don't know if you ever want to be in. That must be the American dream. So that question of like living in an apartment where my rent was raised 70% and then realizing, because we have no rent control, and realizing like, oh, I have money that I could pay for the down payment and have the same, you know, monthly ransom for my housing. but not be evicted, or not lose it. So yes, those questions about something that I don't believe in, really, property ownership, but looking towards it, like I moved, I'm looking over here, diagonally across the street from one apartment building into another apartment building. But in this apartment building, I officially own my, one bedroom on the 4th floor. And what that does allow, but also what it doesn't change, what it changes. And I think I say, what do I say exactly? Basically, not believing that myth, but also wanting the stability of knowing that I have a home that I can control on some level. But I think the other part that I was going to say about something I was afraid to write about was this community accountability process that I was part of, where I was the support person. And it was a process around someone who had been in many intimate relationships and harmed many people. And basically writing about the complete, utter failure of that process. And actually in the writing itself, I still don't know what I can say. And so I don't say it. Like there's a page where I say, I don't know what I can say. And so I'll just leave this page. So I think those are the 3 areas that perhaps were the things that felt the most vulnerable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. There's a lot of great questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just, since a few people in the chat have been talking about things that you've said about nostalgia, both at now, but also at a different reading in time. I'm trying to find it, sorry. But the most recent question about nostalgia says, great, I'm gonna do this too. It says, from Jamie Ryan, Mattilda, you're fabulous. Could you talk a bit more about nostalgia if you want? And the previous question, I mean, I'm sorry, maybe I can find it. Maybe you saw it, Mattilda, too, but there was some question about a quote that you said about nostalgia at a different reading. Maybe someone's pulling it up for me right now. No, I don't see it. Anyway, but so anyway, the nostalgia. I mean, I will just say for those of you who haven't read the book that, and I had a different question about this I didn't get to ask, so now I'm shoving it in. But, on the 3rd page, she writes, I remember when faggots kissed hello. We had so much to fear, and so we feared nothing. I mean, we feared one another, but we feared fear more. And there's a kind of long riff on, I wouldn't call it nostalgia. I would just say, I mean, again, because of our 1973-ness, I just was, really, I was interested in this long period of, I mean, especially because reading this book as I did during COVID, now I'm stuffing another question of mine in, getting to but which just has to do with, what it was like reading about all this, strangers and intimacy and touching during this time. And then, but I guess the segue to nostalgia is that part, I remember when faggots kissed hello, we had so much to fear, and so we feared nothing. It felt like it was written, at a different moment than we're at now, where people have begun to fear each other, their breath and bodies so much again. And I just wondered if you had thoughts about nostalgia, and then also the experience of looking back on the book in the present COVID moment,
Yeah, absolutely. It's been pretty fascinating to have the book come out right now, because when it was about to come out, because I wrote it, it's written in the present, whatever that is. And it felt, like people were telling me, oh, this is very much about now, right? And so in March, April, like now completely changed. Like it was, so, and I thought, oh my God, is this book totally irrelevant? What are people even going to think about it? But people kept telling me, like, as they were reading it, as it was about to be, be published, like, oh my God, this feels so relevant now. And I was like, what are they saying? I don't know. But I think what it is, and I can tell now, is that it's because it is about loneliness and alienation and the quest to connect anyway, that I feel like if it had come out a year ago, of course there would be people who would relate, but I actually feel like now, in many ways, everyone can relate. Because we all are not only aware of the loneliness, but it's like out there, we're talking about it, and the connection, or to segue into nostalgia, I saw the quote that someone was asking about, nostalgia always camouflages violence. And so for me, it is, because nostalgia creates this myth of a golden age that never existed. And you know, it creates, like, let's talk about the early 90s, because that's the time I know a lot about. You know, when I moved to San Francisco, like you know, anyone I met who was older than me, like 10 years or 20 years older than me, older queens, they'd be like, girl, you should have been here in the 70s, you know, oh my God, girl, or this, you know, or the 60s or 70s. And I couldn't even imagine, there's no way to imagine that. I mean, that was when I was born, you know, and I have this realization in the book that the early 90s, because people will say that, oh my God, the early 90s must have been amazing in San Francisco. And I'm like, yes, there were things that were amazing, but it felt like, but everyone was dying, right? And so you can't talk about what's amazing without talking about, you know, a generation of like queers and outsiders and freaks and trans people and sex workers and drug addicts just dying, like vanishing from the earth everywhere you went, like everywhere. Like it was just like a palpable sense, if you were queer, you know, like of death, you know, and that like was the world we lived in. So nostalgia erases that. Instead, it becomes like about like, oh, those cute, or like here, a perfect example. Oh, that cute pink triangle. I love it. I want to get pink triangle earrings. Oh my God. You know, I mean, like, so it's like consuming something without the content, right? And people will do it with anything. They'll even do it with like a silence equals death t-shirt. It's like spelled out right there, but it's just like fashion, right? And so I feel like, and that's always what nostalgia does, I think. So like people, the nostalgia for the 70s, people are like, oh my God, you should have been there. But like now I know, like, you know, that hyper masculinity, that like obsessive, you know, gay body fascism, that like policing the borders and getting rid of like, you know, the trans people, the women, the sex workers, you know, that started then, right? That's the initiation of it, right? So like, so I feel like the opposite of nostalgia is truth. And if we talk about things in all of their messiness, complication, lived experience, nuance, and complexity, then we don't have to feel nostalgic, right? Like I believe in thinking about the past. And the part you mentioned at the beginning of the book, I remember when Faggots Kissed Hello, and like I do, you know, I can feel it palpably now, right? Like that feeling, that was what I was coming of age into. And in the moment when it felt like everyone was dying, like kissing one another was an act of resistance, you know, kissing one another and making it queenie and flamboyant, and kissing one another when we hated each other, you know, kissing a random person you just met. That was just like, boom. And so it was that moment of connection through a shared transgression, even when we didn't acknowledge it. Like it could be like with business gays and with, you know, queer freak weirdos, you know, it was like, it wasn't like a radical act. It was just something that connected us. And that is something I don't know that I would have realized then, that I realize now. But I can't say, oh my God, that was so great. You know, everyone was dying and we were kissing hello. Like, you know, so I feel like to bring it into the present moment, it is intense having this book come out in a moment where touch has become dangerous. And like, so it's not just that white picket fence between, you know, behind someone's eyes. It's actually, there is a valid reason to perhaps fear our breath on one another, you know. And so I get, but it's I guess I will say though, the experience of the book coming out in this moment has it doesn't feel separate at all now that I feel people reading it and the experience of reading it. And so I think maybe that is the possibility of language itself. Like in a way, in the book, what the actualization of embodiment is most present through the language. And so maybe that's what people are relating to. Like, here is this embodiment that I'm craving, and it's in this book. And so I don't know. I feel like, yeah, I think there's a temptation to, I guess, to go back to nostalgia. maybe I'll just wrap that part up, but like there's a temptation to think like, oh my God, it was so much better in March or February when we could touch one another. And that might have been better, but like the book is about craving something that may never happen.
Yeah.
And so I feel like in order to imagine like a future, we have to imagine a future that isn't going back to a past that was already unsatisfying, already filled with hierarchies and violence and structural, interpersonal, intimate repression, violence, you know, like we can't say like, oh, we have to go back to the shine. You know, it's like people are like, oh, I want to go back to Obama. You know, it's like, oh, drone bombing, deportation, you know, imprisonment. Like, what do you want to go back to exactly? I'm not sure. We're still there. Sorry, you know. And so, and that's again, that's a nostalgic vision, right? People are like, Obama, that was hope. And I'm like, honey, if that was hope, you need to start dreaming a little deeper. So I guess for me, yeah, always being aware of all the complications, but also about we need to dream bigger, right? We can't dream about going back to something that was already problematic, hypocritical, violent, you know, where our life, you know, especially in this country, right? Where it's like, we're living in the dominant colonial power in the world. Our lives are predicated on the destruction of the planet, you know? And so, but we still need to create something. In order to go on living, we need to figure out alternatives and figure out ways of actualizing our dreams rather than going back to something that didn't serve us in the first place. And if it did serve us, whoever that us is, we actually need to make room for the people that it didn't serve.
All right. We are moving to the close of this event. So I'm gonna give you author's choice between two questions in the chat. Don't feel bad, people, if the question's not answered, but I only see two more that I haven't really gotten to. So I'll give you these two. I'll roll them down the bowling alley for you, Mattilda, and you can take one. And then, so one is, can you talk about how anti-authoritarian ideas have shaped your work? And the other one is, can you talk more about the relationship between unethical sex and policing? So anti-authoritarian ideas.
Oh, interesting.
Ethical, unethical sex.
Well,
you said both. Or you know.
Well, I would say I can just I'll give a quick answer that well, I don't know. I don't know how to give a quick answer clearly. Someone could ask me a yes or no question and I'll give them like 10 minutes or something. But anti-authoritarian ideas are what formed me. And I feel like before I even knew what that meant, like as a kid, I was that traumatized kid, like escaping into books, you know, chewing hard candy in the back of the classroom, reading War and Peace when I was in 6th grade, you know, reading like Jean-Paul Sartre, you know, by the end of high school, like imagining freedom while knowing that I was trapped, you know. And so that in between reading War and Peace and reading Sartre, you know, it was about figuring out a way, like realizing like, I'm this traumatized kid. Everyone knows it. There was no hiding it. The teachers know it, the kids know it. No one was acknowledging it except to be like, you know, harassing me or something, you know, but like, in order to find the people that could see me, I had to step out of that trauma. And the way I did that was by finding the other kids. Like, I was like, everyone refused to see. So, and basically, even before I knew how to actualize myself, I was like, I wanted to help these kids to not care about everyone who hated us. And so that's an anti-authoritarianism, right? It's like these kids that think we're worthless, garbage, you know, nerds, sissies, faggots, queens, sluts, you know, whatever, like they don't matter. You know, and that's what I was starting to do when I was like 12, 13, 14, 15, you know, and eventually I believed it too, you know, and so even if I didn't have that language for it, just like I didn't have a language for feminism, but I could see it, I could see, misogyny, I could see structural violence, I could see racism, and although I did have a language for anti-racism actually, but not the rest of that. But like, or no, not quite yet. But I guess the question is, so for me, that self-actualization, my self-actualization has always been about anti-authoritarianism, and that means both in like dominant worlds and in our own worlds, because there always are authoritarian tendencies, like even in the most anti-authoritarian worlds, right? Telling us what we can and cannot do, telling us who is and isn't of value. And I think if we're going to work towards like accountability, we also have to see that in ourselves. So I would think, and I feel like if we want, I also could talk about my writing in particular. When I write, I want the form to come through the creation of the text and not the other way around. So I don't want to be like, let me put something in this box. I want the writing and the process of writing to create the form, right? So that is also, I don't, thinking about it now, that's an anti-authoritarian tendency. But also I want the language itself, like not to be bounded by language. So by the rules of language, by the rules of speech, by the rules of writing, by the rules of like the redemptive arc, right? That's like, as writers, we're like, you start, let me tell you about this terrible place and how I arrived there and how I survived and how I'm different now, right? That's the arc. And how I now am worthy. I'm worthy of your attention. And so I start by rejecting all of that, right? Like, I don't want, I feel like we're told to speak to this imagined center, and the imagined center is still straight, white, middle class, Christian, so-called middle America, right? And so, or it's like, Ivy League educated, New York intelligentsia, right? Those are like the center, right? So we all know that neither of those is actually like the center of most people's experience. And so for me, writing is always about redefining that center and refusing to speak to it. I think because as soon as we are explicating our lives, are explicating everything in order to prove our worthiness, then our work in some ways no longer has a soul. And so for me, I always want to work right against those borders and that policing, both like structurally as well as politically and formally.
So super brilliant, and everybody in the comments box is just like, whatever. They're just reveling in your brilliance, and so am I. And someone has asked the very final question, which is what the name of your cat. Oh wait, I'm sorry, that's not about your cat. That's Joey. This like, forget that. That's like a total aside. I'm gonna let Gemma and Joey go out about the cat. From Mattilda, you guys, maybe we can get the Poetry Project staff to unmute everybody, because I think she deserves the biggest applause that we possibly have for this brilliant book. So let's see if we can get that going.
Oh my God, thank you so much, Mattilda and Maggie. Everyone unmuted. Hearing this accomplishment. Oh my God, look at all these amazing faces.
And it's
incredible.
Thank you so much, Mattilda, for your reading and for sharing with us your brilliant insights about your writing process and vulnerability and queer embodiment. And thank you, Maggie, for your great questions and for keeping an eye on the chat. This is actually the final event of our fall season until our New Year's Eve marathon, which is going to be a free 24-hour broadcast that starts on December 31st at 11 p.m. and goes until the 1st at 11 p.m. So I hope you all tune into that. I'm posting an RSVP link in the chat. Thank you both so much. You have to get the freezer door right now. There's a 10% discount at Greenlight, and Corey's posting the link in the chat for you. And can we get another scream, cheer, applause for Mattilda and Maggie, please? And we're going to close out with some house music for Matilda's.
Yay, house music.
So